Villains in literature are everywhere, but some are more disturbing, more relevant, and more compelling than others because they make us face something recognizable in human nature. Those are the figures I want to focus on in my villain series. And today I'm going to talk about the Misfit from Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. If you're looking for a full lecture on the story itself, including the grandmother, grace, religion, and some of the larger questions O'Connor is exploring, I already have that on my channel and it's linked below for you. In this video, though, I want to focus specifically on the Misfit because I think he remains one of the most unsettling villains in American literature, and not for the reason you probably think. Now, most readers remember him because he murders an entire family, and violence tends to dominate our memory of a story. But literature is full of violent people. What interests me about the Misfit is that long after I finish rereading this story, I find myself thinking less about what he does and more about the way he understands the world. O'Connor could have totally written him as this straightforward criminal, but she doesn't. She gives him a voice, a philosophy, and a set of questions that seem to have haunted him for years. Now, one of the things that strikes me every time I teach this story is how often the Misfit returns to the same subjects. He keeps talking about Jesus, punishment, about what happened to him, and whether life even makes sense. And if you think about it, underneath all of these topics, there's a man trying to solve a problem that he's never been able to solve. How do you make sense of a world that refuses to make sense? This question is all over his conversation with the grandmother. In fact, one of the reasons he's such a fascinating villain is he doesn't sound like someone who stopped thinking. If anything, he sounds like someone who's been thinking about the same questions for far too long. He's neither impulsive nor careless, and he's not somebody who drifts through life without reflection. He's a man who seems trapped inside a set of conclusions he can no longer escape. And I think this is where O'Connor begins revealing something very uncomfortable about human beings. Most people have known someone whose pain gradually became the way they explained everything else. Sometimes it happens after a betrayal, a disappointment, a loss, a humiliation, or an injustice. At first, the experience is simply an experience, but over time, something else can happen. The experience stops being one event among many and starts becoming evidence that a person begins using to explain the world and justify themselves. To me, the Misfit feels like that process taken to an extreme. Now, one of the reasons I find him so compelling is that he's not entirely wrong about what he sees. Human beings are hypocritical. The world is unfair. Good people suffer, and bad people sometimes avoid consequences. No matter what we do, life doesn't always arrange itself into a neat moral pattern for us, and the Misfit sees this clearly, which is part of what makes him so persuasive. If O'Connor had made him obviously irrational, we could dismiss him. Instead, she gives him observations that most of us recognize immediately. So the problem isn't what he notices, it's what he does with it. At some point, the Misfit seems to stop treating disappointment as an experience and starts treating it as proof. The unfairness, hypocrisy, and suffering he sees becomes evidence, and gradually those experiences harden into conclusions about the nature of reality itself. That's why I think he remains so relevant, because people do this all the time. Think about it. A person gets betrayed and begins expecting betrayal everywhere. A person gets hurt by someone they trusted and starts assuming everyone has an angle. A person encounters hypocrisy and becomes suspicious of sincerity itself. What begins as a wound slowly becomes a lens. And once it becomes a lens, every new experience starts passing through it. And this is what hardens us, embitters us, and turns us into versions of ourselves we probably don't like or trust as much as what we could be. Now, the reason this process can be so difficult to recognize is that it feels like realism and maturity, if not wisdom. The person often believes they're finally seeing clearly and that they've learned something important about the world. In reality, though, they may simply be allowing an old hurt to organize every new piece of information that comes their way. And this is the version of evil I see in the Misfit. It's not evil as rage or cruelty for its own sake or as some supernatural force completely disconnected from ordinary people. What makes the Misfit disturbing is that he has become convinced that his disappointment reveals the deepest truth about reality. He's looked at suffering and decided suffering is the answer. He's looked at hypocrisy and decided hypocrisy is the answer. He's looked at a world that often fails to make moral sense and concluded that moral meaning cannot be trusted. Now, the conversation about Jesus becomes especially important here. Readers often approach it primarily as a religious discussion, but I think there's also a very human struggle underneath this conversation. The Misfit wants certainty and an answer that settles the argument once and for all. If Jesus raised the dead, then everything changes. If he didn't, then everything changes in a different direction. Now, the thing about the Misfit is he understands the stakes of that question, which is why he keeps returning to it. He's not interested in religion as a social custom. He wants to know whether there's any reason to believe that goodness, justice, suffering, and human life fit together in a meaningful way. But what he can't tolerate is uncertainty, and that matters a lot. One of the most difficult parts of being human is learning to live without final answers. We rarely get complete certainty, perfect explanations, or a neat solution to the largest questions we face. The Misfit seems unable to accept this. He wants proof, a resolution, and a conclusion powerful enough to explain everything. And when he can't find it, disappointment rushes in to fill the space. That's why the grandmother is such an interesting opponent for him. Most readers see them as complete opposites in that she represents faith and goodness while he represents doubt and evil. But if you think about it, O'Connor is doing something much more complicated. The grandmother has her own way of forcing reality into a story that feels manageable, in that she believes she knows who the good people are and what goodness looks like. She places enormous faith in manners, respectability, social status, family background, and appearances, which is why throughout the story she constantly categorizes people, evaluates them, and decides what kind of person they are. Did you notice that the Misfit does something remarkably similar? The difference is that his categories are cynical. The grandmother's worldview simply reassures her, whereas the Misfit's worldview protects him. But no matter what, both of them are trying to make a complicated world feel predictable. That's why their final conversation is so important. By the time they're sitting together in that ditch, many of the stories both characters have been telling themselves are beginning to collapse. The grandmother's confidence, status, and manners no longer help her. The categories she's relied upon throughout the story are suddenly useless. And perhaps for the very first time, she seems to encounter another human being without filtering him through those categories. And it's this moment that leads to one of the most famous lines in all of American literature. After killing her, the Misfit says that she would have been a good woman if somebody had been there to shoot her every minute of her life. Now, readers have argued about this line for decades, and I suspect they always will. What fascinates me is that the Misfit accidentally stumbles onto a profound insight about human beings. People are often most honest when reality strips away their performances. When there's no role left to play, no image left to maintain, and no status left to protect, people sometimes become more truthful than they ever have been before. The tragedy, though, is the Misfit can't imagine arriving at this truth through anything other than violence. He recognizes authenticity, vulnerability, and human weakness. But he's become so attached to his own conclusions that he can no longer imagine redemption, healing, forgiveness, or grace. And that, more than the murders, is what makes him one of the most disturbing villains in literature. Thankfully, most people will never become the Misfit, but many people will encounter and have encountered the temptation he represents The temptation to let disappointment become identity, to let pain become philosophy, and to carry a wound for so long that it begins deciding what is true. And that is why I wanted to include him in this series, because for me, some of the most disturbing villains in literature are rarely the ones who feel completely alien. They're the ones who reveal something recognizable about ourselves and then push it farther than most of us would ever go. The Misfit takes a very human tendency and follows it to a terrifying conclusion. He mistakes pain for truth, disappointment for wisdom, and cynicism for insight. O'Connor understood how seductive that way of thinking can be, and she understood how dangerous it becomes when a person builds an entire worldview around it. That's why readers continue thinking about the Misfit long after the story ends. He's not simply a murderer. He is a man who has spent so much time staring at the world's wounds that he eventually convinced himself those wounds were the whole story. If you enjoyed this lecture, consider subscribing and joining me here and on TikTok, because I make literature an experience you can relate to rather than a discipline you need to memorize. And be sure to check out my other videos on famous villains, including Arnold Friend, Dracula, Humbert Humbert, Frankenstein, and more. Be well.